in the field of education so as to facilitate the creation of national curricula where appropriate in the matter of racism, anti-Semitism and discrimination. Delegates should act so as to prevent and sanction violations of the prohibition against the incitement to genocide in the Genocide Convention, including referrals to the United Nations Security Council to hold perpetrators to account. Delegates should have access to background briefings specifically tailored to parliamentarians to educate them on issues of anti-Semitism, and the Yale Interdisciplinary Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism offered to be a resource for this purpose. And finally, delegates should sanction trade between the European Union, their respective countries, and Iran. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your work and all the delegates here who helped us in putting this together.
Erwin, thank you. We now move to the expert groups, and the first one, report back, is Anthony Julius.
Does that work? Yes. Okay. Forgive me. It takes an expert not to know how to switch on a button. We had a very full discussion with our experts, Mark Gardner, Joel Kotek, David Hirsch, and Jeremy Jones, on the subjects of anti-Semitism and demonizing discourse. Mark Gardner of the CST identified the distinction between anti-Semitic incidents, which CST historically had been in the practice of accumulating, and anti-Semitic discourse. It's the difference, I suppose, between a blow and a fog. It's easier to count the blows than to assess the depth and the strength of the fog. But this is what the CST is now undertaking, in addition to continuing to keep records of individual anti-Semitic attacks. Mark explains that during the Gaza period, there had been a spike both in incidents and in discourse, and there was then some discussion about the relationship between spikes in anti-Semitic activity and the general context which enabled anti-Semitism to prevail in our society. We then talked about the use of code words such as lobby, the way in which Zionists had simply become a more acceptable substitute for the word Jew in anti-Semitic discourse, and we discussed the different spaces that made up the public sphere, the media, the quite different space of private blogs, email traffic, contributions to websites from readers and others, and the contribution made to the public sphere by institutions, political parties, and so on. And there was some feeling that a more differential analysis needed to be undertaken when talking about discourse than perhaps hitherto had been undertaken. Joel Kotek, another activist and scholar, and the author of an important new work on anti-Semitic cartoons, principally in the Arab and Muslim world, but not exclusively, related the cartoons that are now current with Nazi and Soviet precedents, and demonstrated the truly dismal truth that there was an absolute continuity, so that at times it was hard to distinguish between the Nazi precedent and the contemporary instance. That led to a discussion of the provenance of contemporary anti-Semitism. The received view is that anti-Semitism historically comes from the right, but the consensus that emerged during our discussion was not only that it tended now to come from the left or the post-left or the pseudo-left, however one characterizes that space now, but also that it had historical provenance in the left in certain forms of 18th century anti-religious discourse, and in the deprecating of all allegiances other than of the most universal kind. David Hirsch then gave intellectual context to the discussions and made distinctions in relation to talk about Israel and Zionism between the two kinds of war that are taking place in the Middle East, or in that part of the Middle East, the war over territory and for peace which, so to speak, occupies the realm of normal politics, the competition for scarce resources and so on, and that ideological war, which is so one-sided, which is undertaken by the Jews' enemies against the Jews. The burden of his contribution was the importance of distinguishing between the two wars and not allowing the one to overshadow the other in analysis. It became clear that the anti-Semites constitute the stupid party, and the anti-Semites are capable of analysis, and what David and others made clear is that analysis is fundamental to understanding and combating anti-Semitism. We can't rely simply on received understandings. We have to constantly refresh our approaches. Jeremy Jones took us outside of our more provincial preoccupations in London and England, and gave us a tour of international perspectives, but was also able to talk illuminatingly about the particular difficulties within religious institutions, and in particular within Christian institutions, where the preoccupation, entirely understandable concern for the plight of the victim, perceived to be the Palestinian, created a willingness, or openness to forms of anti-Semitic language, where even defamation of Jews, now reconceptualized as oppressors, became tolerable, even something to be welcomed. Of course, as experts, we came to no conclusions, and we therefore make no recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. David Harris.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to you and all of the members of Parliament sitting around the table for this extraordinary opportunity over the last several days. I had the privilege of chairing the session on Internet hate. We had a very talented and spirited group of presenters. They included Michael Wine of the Community Security Trust, Matt Seaton, the editor of Comment is Free of the Guardian newspaper, David Tobe, a blogger for Harry's Place, and Ronald Eysens from the Netherlands, who is the general director of the Magenta Foundation International Network Against Cyber Hate. If I had to summarize our several hours of discussion, I would do so perhaps on a lighter note by referring to an Israeli anecdote of a gentleman who meets a friend of his on the street and says to him, "Isaac, how are you?" And his friend says, in a word, "Good," in two words, "Not good." That seemed to summarize very well our discussion on the role of the Internet. The good was discussed by Minister Frattini last night and by others. It's well known to all of us around the table. But the not so good refers to the fact that in 1990 there were an estimated 1,400 hate sites, if you will, on the then incipient Internet. Today we're told by the experts it's not even possible to count the number of sites. The Internet has become the main incubator, repository, and distributor of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and other forms of racism in the world today. And as we heard earlier from Mr. Wolf, it is an equal opportunity, equal access mechanism. Our young people can now access the Internet, and they can see on YouTube a film of Deborah Lipstadt, your old nemesis David Irving, visiting Auschwitz-Birkenau, speaking in very educated English and explaining to the viewer that indeed there were no gas chambers, there were no crematoria, and how are those watching this film on YouTube supposed to process this information. These were the kinds of issues that